All right, Avatar, the original 2009 movie. I will give my normal spoiler warning, but it has been 13 years since the movie was released, and so if you haven't seen it yet, you're probably never gonna see it. In this movie, we are in the year 2154, and we have gone to the world of Pandora, which is home to a bunch of tall, blue aliens called the Na'vi. And Pandora also happens to be the site of a really rare and valuable mineral called unobtainium that is apparently important enough for this big corporation to go to Pandora and mine it. And to help in these efforts, we have these scientists, and they man these genetically grown Na'vi bodies, which they call avatars. And one of these people is our lead character named Jake Sully. Now, Jake's brother used to be a scientist that was part of this whole program, but he was killed. Since Jake is his twin brother, he can actually man the Na'vi avatar, and so he gets invited along for the trip. One day, Jake and his buddies are in the forest. Jake gets separated from the rest of the group, gets lost, gets found by Neytiri, who is another Na'vi. Neytiri and the rest of the Na'vi invite Jake to learn their ways. Jake gains their trust, eventually falls in love with Neytiri, but the whole time this big corporation, all they want to have happen is for the Na'vi to move away from their home tree, because under it is apparently the biggest deposit of unobtainium for miles, and they decide that a diplomatic solution cannot be reached, and so they end up bulldozing down the tree, killing a bunch of animals and plants and Na'vi. And then Jake commits what might be called treason by some people against his own race and joins with the Na'vi to protect their homeworld, and in the end they succeed, and Jake gets permanently transferred to his avatar body. Now, that was Avatar 1, and then Avatar 2, which is called Avatar: The Way of Water, is coming out later in December. And so they decided to re-release the original Avatar in theaters ahead of that, and you can see it in 3D or IMAX or whatever, like the full screen experience that you can't get at home. It is a little bit interesting to just track the development of these sequels over time. As I had mentioned, the original Avatar was released in 2009, and then in 2010, they were already talking about sequels. And then somewhere in the few years after that, the vision actually became, we're not going to just do one sequel, we're going to do 4 sequels. Super ambitious. And they were going to be sharing production and filming at the same time for some of these, kind of like they did with the Lord of the Rings movies. But then ever since that time, there were just multiple delays, to the point where I was frankly wondering, are these movies ever going to come out? Until earlier this year, where they finally released a teaser trailer for Avatar: The Way of Water. Finally evidence that, yes, they are actually making these movies, and yes, they have actually filmed anything. And so I thought, hey, it's been a while since I've seen this movie, especially in the full theater experience with the 3D and the whole big screen and all of that. And so I thought, hey, perfect chance for me to rewatch the original movie. So first of all, what did I like about this movie? I have to say, it has been really interesting to go back and rewatch this after so many years. When I watched it way back in 2009, I was just really amazed by the entire thing. And I have to say that a lot of that still holds for me, even watching it here in 2022. And I have to say that one of the things that impresses me most about this movie is the overall scope and ambition of just the entire thing. This movie is just really, really big, and you can tell that they were taking a really big swing. They were not holding back any punches. I absolutely love the ambition, even if it doesn't always reach what it was trying to do, which I'll get into in a little bit. And it's just really interesting to remember back to that time, back in 2009, where this movie had been hyped up for years, and I think at that point it had also been delayed multiple times. And so expectations were super high, and I actually thought that at the time the movie met my expectations, at least. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, at that time, the movie's budget was $237 million. That was 2009 dollars, and if you adjust for inflation, that's about $380 million in 2022 dollars. Now, that would be a pretty massive movie today. Like, a lot of the movies today are more in the 100, 200, maybe $250 million range. 380, massive. But I think that the creators would probably say it was worth it, because it ended up grossing $2.8 billion in worldwide box office. Again, that's 2009 dollars, more or less. And so if you convert it to today's dollars, that's about $4 billion. Now, there's some marketing dollars and just other costs that is not built into that production budget of $380 million. But by almost any measure, this was a wildly profitable and successful movie, financially at least. So another thing I like about this movie is that the world itself just feels really well built out. I want to put an asterisk there because there's one element of the world that I think is not so well built out, which I'll get to in a little bit. But especially in terms of just the visual part of the world, the animals, the environments, the plants, the design, the technology, all of that is just really well thought out, really well designed. You You can tell that they spent a ton of time thinking about all of that. I remember reading and watching a lot of behind the scenes and seeing some of the designers and the production staff and all of that. Just really well done. And then the final thing I'll just point out is just the visuals itself in terms of the CGI and all the technical achievements that were required to make this movie a reality. It's easy to take for granted how groundbreaking this was at that time. I think by that time you had other movies like Lord of the Rings and Gollum and things like that. So some of the stuff in here wasn't completely unprecedented, but I think just the overall scale and how much of this movie was filmed in CG and how well done it was, it's a really impressive feat even today. Like, I think it holds up even today when you watch it in the theater. It's not obvious that, hey, this is CGI from 13 years ago. And it's really interesting because in this particular re-release, after the end credits, they show a clip from the new Avatar movie coming up in December. And it's like, yes, that Avatar movie also looks good. And the CGI also looks great. And yes, it probably does look better than the 2009 version, but it's not like leaps and bounds better. And if you were not like trying to compare, you may not be able to tell the difference that well. And so to me, that is just a real testament to the quality of what they did way back in 2009. All right, so what did I not like about the movie? The first thing I'll call out is that it is a bit of a basic narrative that we've seen over and over again. They are borrowing heavily from that standard trope of like, let's go into this native land and explore and become part of your people and whatnot. The Na'vi themselves are basically just a bunch of natives from kind of name your country in the world, down to even their bows and arrows. And when I watched the movie this time, I'm like, why would they have bows and arrows on this foreign world? Stretches my disbelief a little bit. It's also a bit of a white savior narrative because Jake Sully is the one that comes in and learns their ways and then immediately is just their leader and saves them from the other white people. Now, I have to admit, I never really thought about this the first time I saw it way back, but watching it this time, it's like, I can see it and now I can't unsee it. I still enjoyed the film overall, but that whole part is still there. Okay, so then getting back to that asterisk that I mentioned around the world being fully built out, there's one critical thing that I think is not very well built out, and that is the actual story and lore behind Pandora and the Na'vi. I think it's really well built out from a visual perspective, but not much else. Just as a couple of examples, for instance, the Na'vi have their own native language. And yes, they brought a linguist in and they created a new language for this movie. And I'm sure there was a lot of work that went into it. Watching the movie again, that part felt a bit shallow to me. It's almost like, yes, we're creating this new world, and so yes, we must have this language, and so we're gonna make a language just because that's what all stories like this do. And then all of the lore that they do have around like Awa and the like I See You and all the dances and the chants and all of that of the Na'vi people, it just comes off as a bit superficial to me, or a bit too simple and not deep enough. And maybe it's because some of the dialogue and some of the acting in the movie is also a little bit awkward. But I don't know, I just compare it to some of the other stories and media content that I've been consuming lately. Like at the same time that I'm filming this, I'm also watching the new Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power series, and then the Game of Thrones, House of Dragon series. And then, you know, there's a bunch of like Star Wars and Marvel and all of these other just fully built out worlds that I'm consuming right now. And in comparison, the world of Pandora and Avatar just seems not as deep. And so I've been wondering, like, why is that? Now, part of it comes down to probably just how much work was put into the lore and the story itself. Like, if you compare it to J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, like, Tolkien spent just, like, years and years of his life creating that whole world in immense detail. And so there is tons of richness to draw upon. I just don't know if that's what happened with Avatar, at least from a story and lore perspective. So that's probably one part of it. But I think maybe even the bigger part might be how fans have kind of reacted to and latched onto, or maybe not latched onto, the lore and the story of Avatar. It's amazing to note that given how big this movie was and how much money it made, there's a real question around how much cultural impact it actually had. There's been a really interesting ongoing discussion of this in one of my favorite podcasts called The Filmcast. But the basic gist is that there's nothing really from this movie that is super memorable or that is super quoted in popular culture. Nothing like the May the Force Be With You from Star Wars, or any of the constant discussion around like Game of Thrones and the Red Wedding. Like, there's just not much from the Avatar movies that actually gets discussed by people. And because that discussion isn't happening, there's a lot of other stuff that's also not happening. Like for Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and all these other stories, for instance, you have a breadth of just other content that has been created, whether it's by the studios themselves or by the authors themselves, or fan fiction. You know, you have people who are fans of Lord of the Rings who are literally geeking out and learning the languages from those books. So for some of these other properties, you have not only the original creators creating things, but you have an army of just other people who are helping to build this world out. Maybe even beyond that, you have just these masses of people that for these other stories have decided to suspend their disbelief and essentially pretend that these are real worlds, at least in terms of their behavior and how much they talk about it, and like talking about the last episode that happened and all of that. And I would argue that just this didn't really happen for Avatar, and so therefore the world itself just feels a lot smaller and contained and fictional than maybe some of these other worlds. Now maybe this will change as they actually release these other Avatar movies, and hopefully there will be other content that gets generated based on that. It's a world that I hope gets further built out because I think there's a lot of potential there, but I just don't think it's happened yet. All right, so what did I think overall? Well, I will give this movie a 4 out of 5 star rating. I'm almost tempted to give it a 5 out of 5 just for the ambition and the scale and how groundbreaking I thought it was and how much I frankly enjoyed it. But the things that I just talked about are holding me back from giving it that full 5 out of 5 stars. All right, that'll do it for this video. I'm really curious to hear what you have thought about the movie, especially if you have rewatched it. Did your opinion change on it? And so if you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments below. And then as always, if you liked this video, hit the like button, which will help others find it, and subscribe for more. Peace.